let's see. How do we start this? I guess we start from the beginning. I've been thinking about ways to design video game mechanic penalties for the player other than death. This is inspired by a Twitter thread by one of the game developers on Himbo. I don't remember the exact Twitter handle of the individual who started the thread, but it got me thinking about ways to penalize the player in ways that don't require death. Interesting topic in game design. There's a lot of different ways to go, to think about it or to implement it. But I was particularly interested in whether or not a survival game could be designed without death as a mechanic. What I came up with was this idea, and hopefully some of you can use it as sort of an open source design doc. This idea relies pretty heavily on advanced AI techniques and procedural generation, machine learning, far beyond the scope of what I am able to do on my own. So hopefully either this can lay the blueprint for a different team or for my own team later down the line, but it's not something I'm capable of pursuing by myself at the moment. The idea for this survival game is rather simple, really. You're thrown into the map, you play, you craft, you build, you survive, and then when you run out of resources and you faint, your perspective switches from one survivor to another. We'll call this Survivor 2. Survivor 2 is introduced to the island just as you were when you started, but Survivor 1 is still fainted. They are still on the island where you fell. And your new objective is to go revive Survivor 1, and now that Survivor 1 is an AI companion who will play as you were when you were playing the game. If you were focusing mostly on building structures, they will focus mostly on building structures. If you were mostly hunting, they will focus mostly on hunting and gathering materials that way. If you were mostly exploring, they'll simply try to fill out a map that then maybe you can trade back with them, and you can see, where all they have been exploring. And this will happen over and over again every time that you faint and you lose all of your resources. This would require a few things. One, the AI would have to be sophisticated enough so that if a player just wanted to create, an army of people, that simply jumping off a cliff over and over and over again would prove unfruitful. I would imagine the way you do this is that survivors who have been imprinted with simply jumping off a cliff will simply just get themselves into trouble all the time. They'll just walk off cliffs or continue to faint over and over, and they'll be relatively useless to the cause of surviving, right? The world's procedurally generated. At a certain point, at a certain level of mass with survivors, in order to keep things at, a fair population density, they'll function like probes, essentially. They'll just go out on an adventure pretty much in like a straight line, or they'll be looking for something, and they will leave the immediate area and come back with either information or resources from another region. You will never have too many people in one spot. There will always be people leaving and going out and just sort of mapping the procedurally generated map, right? Think about how in Minecraft, the map, it takes up finite space. Like the physical map has a finite space that it maps. But you can continue to go farther and farther out in that direction. It just won't show up on your original map. Your survivors at a certain level of population density will just go out and try to fill out more maps, and they'll try to expand your horizons. They might act like traders down the line. They might go back and forth and try to, find exotic pelts or woods or minerals or whatever. This idea also has some interesting implications with PvP, which I think would only be introduced at certain difficulty tiers, and I'll come back to that later. If you have a group of survivors that are all hunters, that you can sort of have like these little tribes that can fight with each other. And the more you fail in combat, you end up amassing more soldiers. But the more skilled the hunters, they'll last longer. There will be fewer of them, but they will be more advanced AI. And of course, again, with difficulty tiers, this will scale more or less. Something else that I wanted to introduce was this system where if you ignored a survivor, you did not go and revive them after you fainted, they will still get revived, no matter what. If you are not the one to revive them, if you are a certain distance away when their revive timer hits a certain threshold, Survivor C will be introduced as a foreign survivor. They will revive the downed Survivor A, and they will now both be antagonistic towards you. And this, again, is something that will scale based on difficulty levels. It might be only introduced at medium or hard. Maybe at medium, they're more passively antagonistic towards you. They don't really want you to come near. They sort of go off and do their own thing, but will become hostile if you go near or if you breach on their territory. And then maybe on hard mode, they're actively pursuing you. And then you've got, you know, something like a more imminent threat. With behavior recognition for the AI, I would want to have things like when you are building structures, the game will recognize things like rooms or you know, a collection of rooms, different stories, floors, doors, and it will try to incorporate these simple structures that you are building and imprint them onto that survivor when you faint. If I'm going through and I'm building lots of tall houses, when you faint and that survivor becomes an AI, it will aim to build the same kind of structures. It will shoot for single rooms built on top of each other. It may shoot for, you know, more decorative structures if that's what you're going for. Whether or not the computer will be able to pick up on that, I think is possible, but it would take a lot of work. Something like decorative structure would be like, you know, evenly spaced certain materials that don't serve as containers. And I think that you might end up with a really fun effect like those AI generated art, where you feed an AI a bunch of different pieces of art from, you know, different styles or whatever, you know, and it paints a really odd picture that seems like an impressionist version of an art piece. I think we might end up with something like that, which could be kind of fun. If you've got AI that go around and they just build like wooden spokes that are evenly spaced in an artistic pattern, that could be really interesting. I don't know. I think there are ways to make it realistic, maybe more subdued, more organized, but I think it's definitely possible. Again, though, my own coding ability is limited, and my understanding of what is possible for someone either just a little bit more advanced than me or far more advanced than me is skewed by my own limited understanding of how programming works. I have programmed some basic functionality in games, but not enough to know what's on the high end of possible, what's on the low end of possible. Let's see, is there anything else I wanted to talk about with this idea? I think that's mostly it. Respawning without your initial body dying, offering the opportunity to make a village. The idea of this game is sort of very heavily based on the saying, it takes a village. It takes a village to raise a child or to do whatever. Building a village out of your mistakes, I think that's a world with a lot of opportunity. I think that if you have all of these reflections of yourself just trying their best in a harsh world, that really captures the essence of a survival game. I think there are ways to make it a very social experience, but I think initially it's going to grab a lot of people who would probably get into these games by themselves. But I think that being rewarded for trying your best by being partnered with a reflection of that effort could be quite impactful. And that's really the essence of the game that I wanted to get across here. I like to record more of these. I'm not really quite sure what the final format or what the next step of the format is going to look like, but I just wanted to make sure that I got this bit at least recorded. So there we go. It is recorded.